Chapter 9. Before I could react, I was grabbed and hauled to my feet by two of the soldiers. They gripped me so tightly I wanted to scream out in pain, but I was too scared even to make a noise. My feet barely touched the ground as they carried me out of the brush and into the field. "Let me go," Jack shouted. I turned partway around. My brother was struggling against two other soldiers who were pushing and dragging him out into the open. Up ahead there were dozens and dozens of men, the men we'd been staring at. But now all eyes were on us. Desperately I wanted to get away, run or hide, or they held me in their steely grip. It was no use even trying to struggle. I was trapped. I felt like a pig being herded into the back of a truck to be sent to the slaughterhouse. "Where are you taking us?" Jack demanded. There was no answer. I tried as hard as I could not to cry. "Where are you taking us?" Jack called out again. "Shut up," one of the men barked. "Just shut right up, kid." A jeep roared toward us and then squealed to a stop. Jack was thrown into the back seat and I was lifted off the ground and tossed almost on top of him. One of the men, the one from before, climbed into the empty front seat. He looked back at us and his expression was frightening. I pressed myself back into the seat to try and get just a little bit farther away from him. Two of the others climbed up on the back of the jeep so they were standing above us, holding onto the roll bar. "Where to?" the driver asked. "The farmhouse," the man in the passenger seat instructed. The driver nodded, and then the gears of the jeep ground together noisily and it jerked forward, throwing me back against the seat. We circled around the tower. If I had been frightened before the first ride, I was completely terrified this time. I couldn't help but look at the scene around me. There were still men climbing up the wooden structure, and a dozen more sitting at the base in front of another man. It reminded me of the way my class would sit in front of our teacher. As we moved beyond it, I turned slightly around to keep looking and, "Turn back around! You've seen too much already, haven't you now?" the man in the front seat barked. My head snapped back around and I fixed my eyes on the floor. I felt my entire body start to shake, and I bit down on the inside of my cheek to stop myself from crying. I didn't want to cry. I wasn't a baby. The jeep hit a bump and I was bounced into the air. Jack reached out and grabbed me by the leg and pulled me down. I looked over. "I'm here," he mouthed over the roar of the jeep. Of course I knew he was, but somehow him saying that helped stop some of the shaking in my legs. Jack was always there for me, just like with those kids. Jack always said that nobody was allowed to pick on his baby brother. Nobody but him. We quickly left the field and bounced onto a dirt road. Was this the track from the other night? Maybe they were just going to drop us off again, and then I remembered he'd said something about a farmhouse. The jeep began to pick up speed. Off in the distance I could see the lake, dark and ominous. And up ahead the large antenna rose to the clouds, practically scraping the sky. It was getting bigger and bigger as we closed in. I guess I'd have things I could say to Mr. Crumb now, assuming I'd still be alive to say anything to anybody. What were they going to do with us? I didn't even know who these men were, but they had to be soldiers, didn't they? And did that make it better? What was going to happen? The vehicle slowed down and turned onto another larger road that led straight into a forest of chestnut trees. We burst through the woods and suddenly there were buildings all around us. Straight ahead sat an old house and a big barn, and 5 or 6 other buildings that looked newly erected. They were large and long and flat. Was this where that truck Mr. Crumb had followed delivered its lumber? The jeep came to a stop directly in front of the house, an old farmhouse. This was where they were taking us. "Out," the man in the front ordered. Jack and I climbed out of the jeep. My legs were so shaky that I stumbled until I was caught by powerful hands, steadied and then released. Instinctively, I looked around trying to figure out if there was any place to run. In that split second that I hesitated, I was shoved from behind and almost tumbled over again. "Get moving!" Jack and I fell in behind the one man, and the 2 soldiers walked right behind us. I chanced to glance over my shoulder and was shocked to see that they weren't just following behind, but held their rifles in front of them. I tripped up the front stairs of the farmhouse, the sounds of the soldiers' boots thundering against the wooden floor of the porch behind me. My own feet, clad in my soaked sneakers, were silent. The soldier in the lead opened the door. I didn't want to go in there. I had to get away. I stopped and was again shoved from behind, propelled through the open door. I was now standing in a kitchen, or what should have been the kitchen. There were cupboards and a sink, but no stove or fridge or table. There were chairs against the wall on one side of the room, and a large chalkboard had been attached to the opposite wall. "Sit," the man barked, and Jack and I took 2 of the chairs. "Guard them," he said, and he turned and left the room. The 2 soldiers came over and stood right over top of us. "It's going to be okay," Jack said to me quietly. "Ha!" one of the men exclaimed. "That's where you're wrong. That's where you're dead wrong." The shaky feeling in my legs got worse and my whole body started to tremble. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. My chin began shaking and my tongue felt thick, and I couldn't hold back anymore. I started to bawl, and I knew I shouldn't have, but I couldn't control it. Jack would be mad at me for acting like a baby. "Both of you up," barked the man, who had reappeared at the doorway. I staggered to my feet. One of the soldiers grabbed me by the arm and steadied me. We followed him down a hall to a closed door. He knocked. "Come," came a voice through the door. The soldier opened it and entered. Jack went next, and I followed behind. There was a man, an older man, seated behind a large desk. He had a mustache and wore a plain white shirt. In front of the desk were 2 chairs. "Sit, gentlemen," he said, gesturing to the empty seats. Jack and I sat down. I was happy just to be sitting because it didn't feel like my legs could hold me up much longer. "You're dismissed," he said. "Yes, sir." Our escort left, closed the door behind him. Whoever this man was, he was in charge. My eyes had been fixed on the floor, but now I chanced to look at him. He wasn't looking at us. He was studying some papers inside a brown file folder. He looked up and caught me looking at him, and I instantly looked down again. "What do you have to say for yourselves?" the man asked. We're not afraid of you," Jack stammered. The man chuckled. "That is a most peculiar statement. Your brother seems to be rather scared, unless I misread those for tears of joy he's experiencing." Jack shot me a nasty look and said, "Stop your blubbering." But I knew I couldn't. "I think if I were in your position, I would be terrified," the man went on. "We're not," Jack snapped, "and you'd better let us go or you're in big trouble." "I certainly wouldn't want to be in big trouble," the man said. "And just who would cause us that trouble? The police? Or maybe even the army," Jack said. The man suddenly started to laugh. That unnerved me more than being yelled at. He closed the file, stood up, and circled around his desk until he stood right in front of us. He then perched on the edge. "And who exactly do you think we are?" he asked. We're not really sure," I answered uncertainly. "This is a restricted military base," he stated sternly. "We are the army." I swallowed hard and started to cry even louder. "There's nothing to cry about, George." I looked at him wide-eyed. "How do you know his name?" Jack demanded. "I know both your names, Jack, and much, much more." He reached back and grabbed a big folder off his desk and opened it again. "You are Jack Braun, and you certainly are very brave. You are rather a big lad for only 14 years of age. I would have thought you to be older. And George is 12 in a few more days. May I offer you an early birthday greeting?" "Thanks," I sniffled, trying again to put away the tears. "Your mother's name is Christina, although she prefers the name Betty. She is employed at the Defense Industries plant, working on the line. Am I to assume that she is working the swing shift this evening?" I nodded my head. "That would explain the two of you being here instead of safely at home getting ready to be tucked into bed." He turned his eyes back to the file folder. "Your father is serving with the St. Patrick's Regiment. He volunteered for service and is presently stationed in Africa." "You know about our dad?" Jack asked. "I know everything about you two." "It's all right here," he said, tapping the folder with a finger. "But how?" "We are in the business of gathering information. A file is opened on all persons who come to our attention, as you did the other night when you tried to enter our camp. There isn't much that we can't find out, although I have one question that remains unanswered." "What's that?" Jack asked. "Why did you gentlemen return here again?" "Well, we sort of had to," Jack said under his breath. "Had to?" Jack looked down at the ground. "We sort of thought that maybe there were Nazi agents here," he mumbled. "And just why would you think that?" "Because we heard men speaking German," Jack said. "You heard people speaking German today?" "Not today." "The time you were detained?" "Sort of another time we were here," he answered reluctantly. "How many times have you been here?" "Just 3 times," Jack said, "and the first 2 times were by accident. We wouldn't have come again at all if we hadn't seen those men on the bridge," I blurted out. "Men on the bridge?" "They were all dressed in black and they had wires, and we thought they were trying to blow up the bridge," I tried to explain. "Oh, my Lord," he said as he rose to his feet. "You saw people on the bridge?" "And then we heard them speaking German when they were captured, or I guess not really captured, but by the men in the Jeep," Jack added. "And this all took place by the bridge?" "Not really. We followed them in, and then they didn't see us." "You followed some of our men, and they didn't notice?" he asked in disbelief. "There were 4 of them," I said, "and we didn't exactly follow right behind them, but we were close to them. That's when we heard them speaking German, and the men in the Jeep with the guns were speaking German, and then we started to think that everybody was German." "This is most distressing." "Most," he said, shaking his head. "Is there anything else you've seen that I should be made aware of?" "I don't think so," Jack said, "unless you include the airplane landing." "And that tower," I added. "The place where everybody was jumping off that tower with their parachutes?" "And the big antenna," Jack said. "We saw it, but we didn't know what it's for." "I suppose I should at least be grateful that you weren't too close to the demolition exercise," as he paused. "You didn't see us blowing anything up, did you?" Jack shook his head. We just heard about that from Mr. Crumb, I explained. Rayner Crumb, the editor of the Whitby newspaper? I nodded my head. And what brought you to seek out Mr. Crumb? We didn't really go looking for him. We were just sort of talking when we were sorting through my papers, Jack said. And he heard us talking. About this camp? Sort of, but not really, I told him. We were talking about spies and stuff, and he heard us. And did you talk to him about what you'd seen here? Jack shook his head. We didn't talk, we listened. The man nodded his head approvingly. A lesson, it would seem, that my men would be wise to learn. And we agreed that we were not going to talk to him again anyway, Jack said. And why is that? Jack suddenly looked embarrassed. I just thought that maybe he could be a German spy too. It appears that you two boys think that everybody is a German spy. But he is German. He even showed us his medals, I said, defending Jack. Yes, he was quite the hero for the Germans in the First World War. You know about that? I asked. Then I thought things through a little further. Of course he knew about Mr. Crumb. You have a file on him too, don't you? Why would you think that? You said you open files on everybody who comes to your attention like we did, and he was stopped once too, so I thought there'd be a file, I explained. You are a resourceful young man, but I would prefer that you didn't discuss any of this with Mr. Crumb. We won't talk to anybody about anything, I paused. Why did he mention not talking to Mr. Crumb instead of not talking to anybody? You don't think Mr. Crumb is a spy, do you? I asked. Now it was his turn to pause before talking. George, if we thought Mr. Crumb was a spy, don't you think we would have arrested him? Well, sure, of course, I stammered. We wouldn't just let a known spy wander around now, would we? He continued. It's just that he is the editor of the local paper, and I wouldn't want him to become aware of this and possibly write a story. But wouldn't you just censor anything that he tried to write about the camp, I asked. Why, yes, we could, but it's better that he simply not be aware of things, and how is it that you know about censoring stories? Mr. Crumb told us about it, Jack answered. He seems to have told you a great deal, and it is important that neither Mr. Crumb nor anybody else finds out anything from you. Do you boys realize what you have done? No, sir, Jack said, shaking his head. You have somehow managed to penetrate what is supposed to be a highly restricted, highly secure military facility, and in doing so, you have learned far, far more than I would have imagined. We won't tell anybody anything, Jack said. I promised. We won't, honestly, I added. We just want to go home now. I'm afraid that I will not be allowing you gentlemen to leave at this time. But we have to. Our mother is going to call us on her break, and she'll be worried if we're not home. You won't be home for that call. You have left me with no choice.